trying to stay on top of everything happening in business and the legal world, it's like, I don't know, trying to solve a puzzle in the dark.
Yeah.
It really can feel overwhelming sometimes.
Right. There's just so much information flying around.
You shared some super insightful articles from The Economist this week, though.
I get.
And I think, there's actually a common thread we can pull on to make sense of it all.
Heck, you're right.
So in this deep dive, I think the goal is to really, extract the most crucial insights from these Economist pieces. They cover everything from electric vehicles to genetic testing.
Even what happens in those isolated research stations.
Yeah.
It's pretty fascinating stuff.
We're particularly interested in what these articles can tell us about, the major market shifts we're seeing, the growing influence of regulation.
And even how the dynamics within teams can actually play a surprising role in all of this.
For someone who wants to understand these changes but without getting lost in the weeds, I think this is going to be really helpful, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to connect the dots and highlight what really, what truly matters.
Exactly.
So you flagged a bunch of articles.
Okay.
A really interesting look at Tesla's China challenge.
Yes.
A very timely piece on influence peddling under Trump.
Right.
Then there's the chips are down about the semiconductor industry.
Uh-huh.
A somewhat concerning one called Spit Take about 23andMe, the genetic testing company.
Right.
A deep dive into Donald J. Trump v. Big Law. And then finally, teams and extremes.
Looking at those dynamics in Antarctic research stations.
It's quite a collection.
It is a diverse set.
Yeah.
But like you said, I think there's a common thread weaving through them all.
Absolutely.
Shall we start with Tesla and China?
Yeah, let's do that.
What jumped out at you from that article?
Well, for me, I think the headline was just the sheer intensity of the competition that Tesla is now facing. It seems like they're, not the only player in the EV space anymore. Right.
Especially with companies like, BYD, which is a huge Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer.
Yeah.
It feels like a major turning point.
Yeah.
That
right.
BYD has actually surpassed Tesla in market share in China.
I know, right?
And their strategy seems super proactive, not just on price.
No, their technology is really impressive as well.
They've got this God's eye.
Yeah, their advanced driver assistance system.
It's crazy.
It really signals a shift, in the global EV power dynamic.
Yeah.
And it kind of throws down the gauntlet.
Yeah.
Incumbents need to continuously innovate.
Uh-huh.
It's not just about branding anymore.
Not at all.
You've got to have the technology to back it up.
Absolutely.
It's remarkable how fast the competitive landscape can change.
Right.
I mean, even for a company like Tesla, who had such a stronghold,
Yeah.
BYD's ability to just deliver compelling technology at a competitive price point really shows just how dynamic the Chinese market is. Yeah, and it's interesting, the article mentions that even though Tesla cut prices, they still had some underutilized capacity.
At their Shanghai factory.
Yeah, after the Lunar New Year.
It makes you think,
Yeah.
price isn't the only thing that matters to consumers.
Yeah.
There are other factors at play here.
Yeah, I mean, the article mentions that Tesla could leverage, their full self-driving capabilities in China.
That's right.
But it feels like that's still very much in the early stages there.
Very early stage.
Quite a contrast to, the U.S. market.
Yeah, it's a completely different story in the U.S.
Where Tesla's still, the leader.
They are still leading the pack, but they are feeling the heat.
They are.
There's competition coming from all sides.
Ford's electric pickup truck.
Yeah, that's a real contender.
And, the article even mentioned that there's been an overall slowdown in EV market growth in the U.S.
It seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, no.
But it's true.
It's a really interesting aspect of all these, market changes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If we zoom out a bit and look at the global picture, it's clear that the competition in the electric vehicle sector is just heating up worldwide.
Yeah.
Tesla might have been, an early leader.
Yeah.
But now we're seeing both established companies and these new startups all fighting for their share of the market.
For sure.
It's going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out.
Yeah.
It's definitely going to drive innovation, and it could even lead to some price wars.
Potentially, yeah.
Which would be good news for consumers, I guess.
Okay, let's switch gears now to this.
To the regulatory landscape.
To influence peddling under Trump.
Yeah, it was a fascinating read.
It sounds like Washington, D.C. was a hub of activity.
Oh, that's an understatement.
Really?
The article highlights a really substantial increase in lobbying activity.
Uh-huh.
especially among those K Street firms,
It's the heart of lobbying in Washington.
Yeah.
This happened both during and after Trump's presidency.
Wow.
We're talking about over 450 registered lobbyists with ties to Trump.
That's a lot of people.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
And I think it reflects, the significance of the policy changes and the value that people place on those insider connections.
And what were the main areas of focus for all this lobbying?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act was a huge one.
Yeah.
With all those provisions related to climate and healthcare.
Right.
Looking ahead, there's also a lot of anticipation about what a potential second Trump administration might prioritize.
Like what sorts of things?
Things like tax cuts, shifts in energy policy, those sorts of things.
Makes sense.
Interestingly, the article also mentioned that there were bipartisan lobbying efforts.
Oh,
and things like TikTok. So it just goes to show that this kind of influence peddling, it isn't always strictly partisan. It makes sense that, companies would be upping their lobbying efforts, given all these potential policy changes.
Yeah.
And the article really shines a light on the role of those former Trump administration officials.
It does.
How in demand they are by these lobbying firms.
They're seen as a hot commodity.
The article specifically mentioned, Brian Ballard.
Right, Jeff Miller.
David Urban. As being particularly well connected.
Yeah, they have all the right connections.
So, from a business perspective, engaging in lobbying.
Yeah.
It's often about navigating regulations.
It is, and it's about advocating for their interests and trying to anticipate.
Right.
And potentially even shape
policy changes.
Yeah, exactly.
Could impact their bottom line.
It makes perfect sense.
Right. It does, but it does raise that question of, equitable access to influence.
I'm done. Absolutely.
Okay, moving on.
To the world of technology.
To the world of,
The chips are down.
The chips being down.
Right.
It paints a picture of this,
Yeah, it's a critical industry.
A
really intricate industry.
Yeah.
Facing some serious challenges.
What stood out to you from that one?
What stood out to me was the pivotal role of ASML.
Okay.
The article talks about how they are the main supplier of these lithography machines, which are essential for manufacturing the most advanced chips.
And just to clarify for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with this, these are the machines that basically print
That's a good way to put it.
The tiny circuits on microchip.
Yeah.
Right.
They're incredibly precise.
Wow.
So yeah, ASML's dominance, it gives them considerable leverage.
Yeah.
But it also makes them a key point of vulnerability in this current geopolitical climate.
Because of the tensions between the U.S. and China.
Exactly.
Right. The article mentions, the Dutch government, under pressure from the U.S., imposed restrictions on ASML so that they can't export those high-end machines to China.
Right. And that has some significant implications.
Yeah, I bet. Yep.
China's obviously trying to develop their own advanced chip manufacturing capabilities.
Right.
But the article points out that there's a huge technological gap.
Between where they are now.
Huge.
Yeah.
And where they need to be.
And where they need to be.
To compete on that level.
Wow.
So this endeavor is going to be much more expensive. And it could result in, chips that are less advanced.
Less advanced.
Than what you would get from, other manufacturers.
I see.
The key takeaway here, I think, is that the competition in semiconductor technology has become a central battleground in U.S.-China relations.
Wow.
It has profound implications for, technological progress across many sectors.
It's huge.
And for national security.
I mean, it's like potentially, further restrictions on this technology transfer.
It could have massive ripple effects.
Wow.
Throughout the global supply chain.
It's a good point. It's just
a reminder.
A reminder of how interconnected and potentially fragile our global tech supply chain is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One weak link can bring the whole system down.
Okay.
Shall we move on to Spit Take?
Yeah, Spit Take, the article about 23andMe.
That was an interesting one.
That one sounded like a company facing some real headwinds.
Yeah, it does. It portrays a company at a critical point in its journey, for sure.
So what's the main story there?
Well, they've got this vast collection of genetic data from millions of users.
Yeah.
But they've really struggled to figure out a sustainable business model.
Wow.
Their valuation has gone down. They've had to lay off staff.
Oh, gosh.
And their attempt to pivot into drug development just hasn't panned out the way they hoped.
It's interesting, it really shows the challenges.
It does.
Of, leveraging all this personal data for profit.
Yeah.
While also navigating the increasing demands for privacy and security.
Absolutely.
And those privacy concerns really, became tangible with the data breach they had.
Yeah, that was a major setback for them.
It affected a huge chunk of their user base.
It did. And the article mentions there were class action lawsuits filed.
Right.
Which is understandable, really.
And it just highlights how sensitive this genetic information is.
Absolutely.
And the long-term consequences of these kinds of breaches.
The implications are huge.
Yeah.
And I think, if we think about it more broadly,
yeah,
the situation with 23andMe really highlights the challenges that all companies face when it comes to protecting and utilizing consumer data.
Especially in, when it's as personal as...
Especially when it's genetic information.
Yeah, genetic information.
It's about the most personal data you can get.
It feeds into those, ongoing conversations about who owns our data, who controls it.
Who has the right to use it.
And what companies' responsibilities are.
Exactly.
When they hold so much of our personal information.
It's a really important conversation.
Okay, now the article on...
Donald J. Trump v. Big Law.
Donald J. Trump v. Big Law was also super revealing.
I thought so too.
It really seems like the legal landscape for the former president has shifted.
It has. It's noticeable.
The article, details this growing trend among major law firms to be really hesitant about representing Donald Trump and his allies.
Particularly in anything related to the election.
Especially that.
It's a big shift from how things used to be.
What do you think is driving this?
I mean, it's not just about the outcome of the cases, right?
Yeah, I don't think so.
The article suggests it's more than that.
Okay.
Reputational risks are a big factor.
Okay.
Representing such a polarizing figure can be damaging to a firm's image.
Yeah, I see that.
And then there's the potential for internal disagreements among the partners about whether or not to take on these cases.
Yeah.
There are also ethical considerations,
Right.
Concerns about potentially undermining democratic norms.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Especially in firms where there are a lot of people who
oppose Trump.
Who strongly oppose Trump.
So it sounds like the bigger firms are stepping back.
Yeah, they're distancing themselves.
What's Trump's strategy now?
Well, the article says he's increasingly relying on smaller firms.
Okay.
And individual lawyers.
I see.
Which probably presents its own set of challenges.
Like what?
Smaller firms may not have the same resources or the specialized expertise that you'd find in those larger firms. The article also hinted at potential financial pressures and the difficulty of attracting top legal talent.
Right.
Because so many of the established firms are reluctant to get involved.
Don't want to touch it.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in.
This raises another question about, equal access.
Equal access to legal representation.
Yeah.
It's an important issue.
It is. Okay.
We have one more article to discuss.
Yeah, the one about...
Teams and Extremes?
The research station?
Yeah, the Antarctic Research Station.
On the surface, it might seem,
Yeah, it might seem a bit out there.
Yeah, a bit out there. But there are some interesting parallels, right?
Absolutely.
So what's the main takeaway there?
Well, Concordia Research Station, it's in Antarctica.
Yeah.
And it's a really unique environment because it allows researchers to study the effects of long-term isolation and stress on small teams.
Interesting.
It's like a simulation of what you might encounter on an extended space mission.
Got it. Okay.
And what they found was really fascinating.
Okay.
They observed that people become really sensitive to negative interactions when they're in that kind of environment.
So even small issues.
Small issues can escalate quickly.
Could escalate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
They also noted a tendency for people to withdraw when they're faced with conflict or difficult team members.
Interesting.
Instead of, addressing things head on.
Right, right.
And there was also an increase in psychological and psychosomatic symptoms.
Wow.
What's really interesting is that the study really emphasizes the importance of good leadership.
Okay.
Positive leadership is crucial.
Okay.
In terms of mitigating those negative effects and fostering a sense of team cohesion.
Yeah.
In these kinds of,
challenging environments.
Challenging environments.
So, I mean, how does this, apply to life outside of Antarctica?
That's a great question.
I can see how these findings would be relevant to, high-pressure work environments.
Absolutely.
Remote teams facing tight deadlines.
Right, exactly.
Intense scrutiny.
The dynamics that we see in this extreme setting can provide valuable insights into team dynamics anywhere. Especially when people are working closely together under pressure.
Absolutely.
It highlights the need for effective communication.
Yeah.
Good conflict resolution skills and supportive leadership.
To keep the team functioning.
Exactly, to maintain well-being and productivity.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
It makes you think about your own experiences with team collaborations.
And the impact of, different leadership styles.
Exactly.
So, putting it all together, it is striking, how these seemingly disparate articles all touch on some fundamental themes.
Common threads.
Yeah, we're seeing, competition intensify.
Across all sorts of industries.
From, electric vehicles in China to the semiconductor industry.
Big global phenomenon.
And we're seeing the influence of regulation and lobbying.
Absolutely.
Shaping decisions.
Shaping business decisions,
Technological disruption is a constant.
It's
not going away, with all this potential, but also all these risks.
As we saw with the semiconductors and the genetic testing.
And then, those ethical considerations.
In the legal profession. Those are becoming really prominent.
And then, that human element.
From the Antarctic research.
That really underscores how important.
It's all connected.
It is.
To understanding these complexities. We can't just look at each event in isolation.
Right.
We have to recognize those underlying forces at play.
That's a real aha moment.
It is.
It's like the geopolitical tensions,
absolutely,
technology,
economic
pressures driving competition,
societal concerns about data privacy,
right,
and those basic human needs that shape how we work together.
Wow. Okay, so a lot to think about.
Yeah, as we wrap this up, looking at all these trends, the competition, the regulation, the tech race,
the ethical questions,
the team dynamics, which do you think might have the most significant impact?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
But they're all interconnected.
In the years ahead.
Yeah. It's definitely something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's not just about the headline.
It's about those deeper trends.
Yeah.
It requires us to think critically.
Yeah.
And really consider those long-term implications.
Thank you for sharing these articles.
Oh, you're welcome.
They've been incredibly insightful.
Glad you enjoyed them.
This has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
And I'm already looking forward to the next one.
Me too.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again.
You're welcome.